Jessica, thanks for coming on the show.
Garry, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So I guess I'm really interested in getting the stories that you feel like are a little bit untold. And then just as you created Founders at Work to sort of capture the origin stories, I'd love to capture the origin story of Jessica Livingston, if that's possible.
It'll be quick. There's not much to it.
I always felt like you grew up in the Northeast. Is that correct? Like what was growing up like for you?
I grew up in a town called Wellesley outside of Boston, typical, nice suburb. And I had a little bit of an unconventional childhood in that my parents got divorced when I was 6 months old. My father raised me. My mother left. So my father raised me, but because he was working, I lived with my grandmother, his mother, down the road all during the week. And she was essentially my mother. And, in the 70s, now, of course, that wouldn't be unconventional at all, would it? But back in the 70s, it was very strange. Like I didn't know anyone who didn't have a mom. But for the most part, it was a pretty conventional childhood. Outside of that, I, had a lot of friends at school. Academically, I worked really hard when I was young, and I liked sports. I was pretty typical kid.
What kind of sports did you play?
In elementary school, I played everything. I was excited about everything. But then as I got older and into high school, I played soccer, and I played goalkeeper in soccer. And I really liked that. That was sort of my focus.
What did your dad do for work? Like how did you sort of, obviously now and since you've just become literally the social radar for what business is and could be, what was that interaction like? If you had to reflect on that.
This is why it's so strange. I mean, I'm so grateful that I finally got involved in startups. And I always feel like I got involved in startups like 15 years too late, because my dad, believe it or not, worked at the same company for his entire career. He worked at the Gillette company, and he did various things. He worked for different divisions, so it wasn't like the exact same job for 35 years or 40 years or however long he worked, but he always worked for Gillette, and he commuted in with a suit every day. And, it was great because it was very predictable, and he was home for dinner and, didn't work on weekends. It was, very good for me as his only child at the time. So we were really close, but that's what seemed normal to me. Like I never knew anyone. I don't even know if I knew anyone who had their own business, much less a startup. And in fact, I have told this story once before, but when I decided with Paul to start Y Combinator, I remember the most scary part about it was just telling my father that I was quitting my job at an investment bank that had all benefits and had a secure salary and all of that. I remember being so scared to tell him that I was doing this new idea that I couldn't even barely explain because we didn't really even know exactly what it looked like. It was just, I'm doing an investment company with Paul. And I remember the first thing he said was, he looked at me, probably a bit shocked, and then he said, "Does it have healthcare coverage?" That's what you care about as a parent. And I, of course, said no, but I'll go on Cobra or something. But yes, he had a very traditional sort of job that he was very good at, but it was traditional.
Makes sense. Was it like marketing or sales, engineering? Was there a particular focus?
It was all in accounting and finance.
That makes sense.
He is a numbers person and very organized, fastidious and organized. And I am not a numbers person. He's sort of appalled how I struggle to read a balance sheet sometimes.
After getting to know you over many years, you seem like an extreme people person to me. Were you always like that? Jessica, in high school, what was that like?
That's an interesting question because high school was sort of unique. I will say I was a people person. I had lots of friends. I always liked people. And because I grew up as an only child, I really depended on these friends. And I'd have lots of sleepovers, or I'd stay over at friends' houses all the time. So I was always doing stuff with friends because it was, kind of lonely at home. But when I got into high school, I wasn't quite as much of a people person, I think. I went to this boarding school that was very academically rigorous. And unfortunately for me, I think it was too much for me. I had gone to a school that, I was a straight A student, did very well, and then switching to this much more difficult school, I struggled and sort of lost my confidence. So I think I became less of a people person in high school, but then in college, I was pretty social in college. I spent a
Yeah.
lot of time socializing, and I laugh a lot because when people ask about the social radar, do you learn this sort of thing? First of all, I don't think I can read people all that well, maybe better than Paul, Paul, my husband. But I will admit that in college, I did spend an extraordinary amount of time analyzing situations, romantic situations with my friends. And, oh, what do you think he meant by that? Or, just spending a lot of time. I'm always drawn to people's personalities and what's going on. So that is definitely, that interest is innate.
It is funny how in like social settings, so much can be communicated in like the turn of a phrase or just nonverbal communication. Just like, did you see the way that person, looked at, and even during YC, I always thought it was fascinating how the 10-minute interview was so powerful because you could tell
Yeah.
so much about a person even in an incredibly short amount of time.
Oh my God, so much information. If you're looking for it, so much information like body language. I often tell people like we'd be doing an interview. I remember there was one where the co-founder was talking and the other person literally put their arm in front of them and said, I'll take that question. Like basically shut up. And I'm sure that person like didn't mean to do that, but there's so much body language and sort of expressions say a lot too.
What would you say to, I don't know, the 16 or 18-year-old version of yourself? Like if you just explained what happened in over the course of your career and life thus far, like would that be surprising to you?
Oh, very surprising. I would say, honestly, when I was 16, I was pretty lost. And I think it's because I wasn't great at school anymore and I didn't have a project. I just sort of I just felt sort of unmoored for many years, actually. And, it was very clear to me that like I just sort of felt like an outcast, sort of like a bit of a loser. And I've written about this in a blog post I did called Grow the Puzzle Around You, which essentially was a little bit the most autobiographical thing I've ever written. And it really is to inspire other people. Like, if I can become successful at doing something like this, you can too. Because I guarantee you, the teachers in my high school, I'm sure had written me off as totally irrelevant. And like, I never would have been voted most likely to succeed. I was not, I bet teachers wouldn't even remember my name if you said it or who I was. I was that, I just blended in. I mean, if I could send a little message back to me, I would change a lot. I mean, the first thing I'd say is like, it's going to get easier. I don't know. And I'd say focus on your schoolwork because you are pretty smart. And if you I think I got so insecure about struggling that I didn't know how to ask for help. And so I would have told myself like, focus on getting better grades. And I honestly wish I had sort of learned to build things back then or learned to program. As you know, I'm in my 50s now. I never say never, but I really don't think it's in the cards for me to program. I'll just ask Paul to do it or one of the many other programmers I know. But I wish I had experimented with that. I wish I had experimented with all sorts of different, studies and fields. And I totally gave up on math. I dropped math after junior year, never took it again, swore it off. And then when I went to college, I just didn't work hard. I think I'd tell myself, maybe take a gap year and sort yourself out for a year, just take a little breather. and get energized to go back to college, because I kind of squandered my college years a little bit, not working hard.
Hmm.
And then strangely, and I graduated with a degree in English, which is not really that practical. Can't do a whole lot with that. Although I tell Paul this all the time. I say, I do think it helped me with writing, at least practicing. But I remember when I first started working, I got a job at Fidelity Investments right out of college because, Garry, Fidelity was a big company in Boston, and that's what I knew. You know, my dad had worked at Gillette, also based in Boston. For me, I didn't know what I wanted to do, and a friend was like, well, they have a training program. Why don't you go work there? And I just sort of thought, okay, well, that's safe, you know, I trust that. So when I started working at Fidelity, I loved working. It like changed I just felt like trying hard. I felt like doing a good job. And I really, really enjoyed sort of focusing during the day at what I was doing, and then not having to like write papers or, you know, study for exams and things like that.
I mean, finance chose you in some respect then, it sounds like.
Randomly.
What was that process like? I mean, because even by college, like graduation's coming, like all the different options sort of like unfold. And then it sounds like that there was a program for leadership really spoke to you. Or just like, man, it's like sort of like
What,
a program
Garry?
Oh, I don't know.
Garry, a program for leadership.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, it
God.
sounded like there was like a thing that you wanted to do. Like you were like, oh,
No.
here's a thing that I could go start in. I don't know.
No,
People
Garry,
like programs.
Let me be clear. I'm playing, when you say finance, we're playing fast and loose with the like definition. I was in like a customer service call center for mutual funds at Fidelity Investments.
Okay.
If you own, you know, the long-term growth fund or Magellan fund or whatever, Contra fund, you know, and actually I started out at the lowest point you could, customer service. I couldn't even make a trade. Customer service, you wanted to change the beneficiary on your account? I took care of that. You wanted to know what your account was worth or change your address? I did all of that. You know, and if I couldn't help you, I'd transfer to the brokerage department to do the trades, or if you wanted to make a new investment, transfer you to the sales. So, and oh, by the way, it was the night shift. It was like, well, it wasn't fully the night shift. It was 3:30 p.m. to midnight. That was my shift. And actually, I was just psyched to have a job and to be getting paid something. You know, I loved getting paid. And there was a nice group. So like they train you. That was the great thing about Fidelity, is that they bring you on, you know, me with an English major, someone else with something else. As long as you're a smart person, they'd train you on a lot about mutual funds and how everything worked. And then once I was into the organization, that's when I got, as everyone did, you know, a little bit more ambitious. And I studied for my Series 6, Series 7, and 63, which are these brokerage, you know, licensing things that, you know, not the hardest thing in the world, but also you definitely had to study at them, and passed. And then I was able to move into the sales group and make trades. And I mean, it's still a little frightening thinking of me at age 24 advising people on where to put their retirement money or whatever. But, you know, the Fidelity, to their credit, did teach everyone a lot of things. And I did that for like a year and a half or 2 years. Yeah.
So it was, I guess, a lot of explaining to people how like pretty complicated things work actually, or here's what you should do.
Yeah, although honestly, mutual funds, which is what I was focused on, I mean, nothing more fancy than that. They're pretty straightforward. And, you know, there is, it's pretty, if you distill it down to, you know, if you have a long-term time horizon, how risky do you want to be, that sort of thing. There is, it's not that hard to understand. It's not like I was choosing specific stocks or doing anything more complicated than like mutual funds. But it was a great experience. I got these licenses. I was able to sort of parlay that experience into my first job, where I moved to New York City and worked at an agency. It was like an investor relations agency for healthcare and biotech companies. And so there, what I did was it was in the late 90s, so there were a lot of companies going public, a lot of companies getting acquired, and you had to have basically a PR firm that tried to communicate directly with the mutual fund companies and the fund managers and the research analysts, who were ranking the stocks and things like that. And we'd set up quarterly earnings calls, and of course we were using faxes back then, because email was out, but it was just starting to become more adopted. So the way that the analysts heard, where the companies made announcements for their quarterly conference calls was on a fax. So we used to send stuff through a fax machine, and wrote a million press releases, and we got media interviews, and it was really very interesting. Again, because at the time, late 90s, it was the bubble. Lots of exciting stuff was happening.
Basically, I mean, this was even before the internet, right? So all of this is online now, or maybe it was just beginning.
It was just beginning, and it was this company in New York. So it was in like 1995. That's when I first used like Netscape Navigator to find stuff. It was just starting to happen.
I guess it's interesting to reflect on. That's how people would raise money. And that's how people would get started. And that's how still a lot of people raise money or get started, is they sort of start a business, and then later they have to hire sort of a PR firm or like an agent to go out there and try to raise money for them.
Well, we wouldn't raise money for them. We would, like, my job was to call, or, to try to gather interest. I would set up meetings with research analysts, who would cover companies in the biotech or healthcare space, and get meetings with them in hopes that, Morgan Stanley would pick up coverage on this company, or, meet with the fund managers, at Fidelity or Warburg Pincus and all these companies.
Were these public companies?
Yeah, a lot of them, they were either going to go public soon, or they were public. But back then, I mean, this is in the late 90s, companies were going public. Companies were like getting slapped together to go public. It was crazy.
Yeah. I guess today those companies are increasingly staying private.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And then there's all these other ways to keep the companies like sort of funded and growing and alive, which is interesting.
And this was before stuff like Sarbanes-Oxley and stuff like that. But, I loved being in New York. Very social, definitely a people person there. I was very interested in my job and writing stuff and, promoting people and, with their constituencies and stuff like that. And I liked it. It was a bit of it was like long hours, really long hours. You'd have to work. But I was young, so I didn't really mind.
I'm curious, like, what would, the Jessica of that time think of what you know now or what you've seen now? Like, It must have been a shock to think about, okay, well, here are these public companies, and then here are the people who have money, and then we have to explain to them that the company's good. And then embedded in that is like, shoot, there's like demo day in there, how we help companies, or even in our office hours, like, say this, don't say that, right? Like, were you doing that kind of thing back then?
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, we'd be writing, roadshow presentations. I mean, we wouldn't write it from scratch. We'd be collaborating with the CEO and the CFO. But there's a lot of storytelling. I'll say that. And I worked on a few annual reports. So there was a bit of that. And, press releases, I always joke because they seem so formulaic, but I think they're sort of a useful thing to be able to concisely and clearly persuade people. I'm not saying I'm very good at persuading people, as evidenced by some of my early efforts at YC with the press and stuff, but I enjoyed it. So after I spent a few years in New York City and I always used to tell people it was a great place to live when I could afford not to be able to afford to live there. Like, I didn't save up a cent. And one thing I wish I could go back and beat myself over my head about was, why did I just throw away so much money? Like, why didn't I save my money? Because what gives people power and flexibility in terms of their career, in my mind now, young people, is having some sort of nest egg that you can fall back on if you ever got fired or laid off. If you wanted to start a startup and you could pay the rent for a year, you'd be able to take a risk. But when you're living paycheck to paycheck, which I essentially was, you can't lose that job. You can't leave that job. And I blew through it, like an idiot. I was 25, but I was so irresponsible. So irresponsible. So finally I decided, I'm going to go back to Boston where my dad was and still had a lot of friends and stuff there. And what did I do? Oh, I know what I did. I worked at this magazine called Food and Wine Magazine. Have you ever heard of it, Garry? I feel like it's pretty mainstream.
Yeah, totally.
And, it would have like this big event called every year in Aspen, Colorado called, oh my God, the Classic at Aspen. That's what it was called. And they'd have like Jacques Pepin and Emeril Lagasse, Bobby Flay, all these people. And I worked on that for 9 months and I loved it. I didn't get paid much. And this is what happened. So I worked on that to do a total change, like get out of the finance world and just sort of do more event and marketing. And I loved it, but I didn't get paid much. And so then I said, I better go back to Boston. And I moved back in with my dad at that point. And then I got a job. Well, I ran a marathon in between moving and going back to Boston. I sort of spent 2 months training for a marathon and I did one and done.
Amazing.
Check that off my bucket list. That was in 1998. Yeah. And then I got a job at this consulting company in the automotive industry, but doing their conferences. They had a bunch of conferences and I would plan those. And I loved it. I loved running events. I don't know. I don't know why. I just did.
That to this day is like a huge part of what YC is.
It is.
We have software and we have events, and it's like sort of all of the things like are actually have to work together to make it work.
Well, this is what I wrote about in Grow the Puzzle Around You. I had this like really kind of random background and like events I could run with an arm, tied behind my back. And so YC though was so much about events and still is, like you say. But back when it was just me, Paul, Robert, and Trevor, the events were on a much smaller scale, but they were still events. The dinners were events. Interviews essentially were events because we had people coming in and out the door and you had to plan the logistics and how do you greet people and have food for them while they're waiting and all that stuff and keep everything running on time. And then we do startup school, which was our big event every year. And that, was a couple hundred people, but it would grow every year to hundreds and hundreds till it was like 1,000. And so events were always a very important part of YC. And I was able to do those by myself for many years.
I guess your story really reminds me of at 25, I also 22 to 24, I was definitely spending every dollar I was getting from Microsoft. So
that makes me feel
great
better.
Advice. I was definitely doing that. And then I also had I don't like this anymore. How do I do something very extreme that's like different? And then I tried to be a hip hop photographer for a magazine. Also a magazine.
For which magazine?
I think it was I can't remember what it was called. It was like a hip hop magazine out of East Palo Alto. I don't remember the magazine that I did. It was just hip hop, something rather magazine. But I mean, it wasn't a big magazine. And then what's funny though, is I remember the name of the other magazine the producer did, or the guy who I worked for did. And it was Damn Girl Magazine. And it was like a pinup magazine. And I was like, sorry, I can't work on that one, but.
Oh my gosh. You never told me that. I never knew that about you.
That was right before. That was why I went to the startup school events with my camera. So I had these giant, because that was my gear that I was trying to turn into an editorial photographer.
Oh my gosh.
That was my pipe dream. So.
And instead you started Posturous instead.
Yep.
This is the thing, though. I think, like, I love how I had a sort of random and varied background, I guess, because I am where I am now. Now, if I could, like, give myself advice back then, I would have said, first of all, I was a very hard worker, even though in college I was not. Once I got into the real world and employed, I worked very hard. Well, I should have joined a startup. I couldn't program, but I could do everything else. And, as you know, the early days of a startup, you just have to have someone doing a little bit of everything. And I'm certain I would have been a good early employee at a startup, but I didn't know what they were. I didn't know anyone who worked at them. It was this completely foreign world to me. And so I think young people are lucky now because even if their direct family aren't involved in startups, it's out there. You can find startups and information about startups much more easily.
I guess the wild thing is there are going to be people watching this right now who are literally in those shoes and they're like, oh, what is this thing? How do I get over there? So that's why this media is like not necessarily it's for basically us when we were, from 20 or 30 years ago, actually.
Well, then here's the advice that it's going to sound, I'm not joking when I say this, but I'm a little bit joking. Like, I cannot tell you what a loser I felt like in high school and college. Like, just didn't feel very good at anything, didn't feel very ambitious or interested in much. I mean, I had friends and I had a lot of fun and all of that, but I just was not very focused on anything. And I don't think people thought that I'd probably accomplish very much. I don't think they had super high hopes for me. And the point is, like, anyone can do what they want later in life if they focus, And it took me a long time. We didn't start Y Combinator till I was, I think, 33. So I feel like I lost this decade of really an important time in my life. I mean, my 20s were when I had the most energy and was the least distracted as a human being. I mean, if I could have started a startup in my 20s, I would give anything to go back and be able to do that. Because now it's like I'm distracted by a million things. I feel like I need to practically take a nap every day. I just do not have nearly as much focus and energy as I did. But anyone, if they are okay with the risk and have some, interesting ideas and are open to possibilities, I feel like they can do it.
I guess one thing that's coming out from this is, there are just so many, you would find a job and then you would learn something from it and then you'd sort of move on, whether it's communication or working PR, working with investors and then events. I mean, Food of Land sounded like It was a really fun time, actually, because that was also even seeing an event at that scale, at that level of taste and refinement was very useful.
A very complex event. They had a whole team of people that worked all year round on it. I just came in as sort of a intern kind of thing. But the last step on this job thing before YC was that after the automotive consulting conference planning thing, I got a job in the marketing department of a boutique investment bank in Boston. And for the most part, I really loved it there because I was doing a little bit of everything. And this job was PR, marketing, writing, press relations and things. It was just a little bit of everything that I had done. There was an annual, conference at this bank, and it was really fun. I don't know if the rest of the bank really valued what we were doing, but I had a really nice boss and liked my team, and I sort of enjoyed what we were doing until the bubble burst and they had all these cutbacks and I had to, fire people. And then, the other people at the investment bank really didn't want any money going to marketing. And I finally said, this is sort of a drag.
What was doing marketing for that like? Who were sort of the people you were trying to reach, and what were the messages that actually landed for them?
So the bank was it was called Adams, Harkness and Hill, and it had been around for a while, but it was a boutique bank. It was very small compared. It wasn't like on the level of Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and Merrill Lynch and all those ones. It had traditionally been focused on Boston companies, doing M&A, trading. They had research analysts, covering companies in certain sectors. It was primarily like technology, healthcare, and consumer companies. But when I joined, they were really trying to expand nationally and change their reputation. Their sort of, I don't want to say like sleepy reputation, but that's kind of what it was. So expand their reputation. And that was fun. My boss came on and got like a budget kind of for the first time. There was an organized marketing push. And we did this like whole advertising campaign in like the Red Herring. Do you remember that publication? And this is back when people read magazines, paper magazines. And so we worked on like the messages we were basically trying to say is like, we can offer you should choose us as your investment bank because we're just as good as the big guys, basically, but you get more personalized service. I forget all of the different things, but we did all these focus groups and just like, it was just really interesting. And we then tried to also like promote the different organizations within the bank that had never gotten special interest in them. Like I remember the trading floor, like, let's face it, one trading group, it's hard to distinguish trading groups at the different banks. They all kind of are doing the same thing. And the traders were, what's the right word? They were a bit of a hardcore group, let's just say. And they weren't as refined, maybe, and polite at sometimes as maybe the investment bankers were. But, they said, look, we want to be on the cover of Traders magazine. That's all we care about, just get some legitimacy, amongst their peers and things. And I remember finally we got them on the cover of Traders magazine, and the photo was like taken on our trading floor with it was like from way above, showing all the traders. And I remember just being like, yes, we finally delivered for these guys. Cause I really liked the traders, and we wanted to help them. And that was what they had wanted,
That's
It was
awesome.
fun.
Is it just like reaching out, getting to the right people, and then boom, there it is? Or
We actually worked with a PR firm, this great agency up in Portland, Maine. And they kind of we started building a relationship.
just getting to know people?
It's just getting to know people. And, can we help you understand, like, just being proactive, like our traders can talk about X, Y, and Z. If you ever need someone, please let us know. Oh, and I remember we also got the budget to install a camera on the trading floor. So we could now pitch to CNBC and all of those TV station, television shows. And once we started having our analysts, investment bankers, traders being interviewed on our bustling trading floor, that was a total game changer.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. So it was all like just step by step, trying to get a little bit more publicity. And then if a reporter's writing something, they need to call someone they can trust will share a few interesting insights. So we got, calls much more often once we just started appearing and had that camera capability.
I guess what's emerging is like so many of the things that YC became good at, like sort of came out of a lot of your experiences. Cause like being able to deal with media or like get placement or like build those relationships was like a whole thing. And then there's like media and there's events. And then when you add software and then you guys, all of that together created community, it's like a lot of these things sort of come together a little bit more. It's like sort of magical set of things, really.
Yes, it is a sort of magical set of things that you don't know what these things are going to be. Like it depends, you know what I mean? Like anything can be a magical combination. I do hesitate to take any credit with Y Combinator and the media because I really stunk.
You're just being modest.
No, I'm really not. Like no one
early then,
would
I
write
don't know.
about us early on. And I just, yeah. I feel like when I think back of my relationships with the press and YC, I feel like many were not very good. I don't know. Because it's funny because it went from being desperate for the press to write about Y Combinator, and getting some publicity. And for like a year, it was terrific. And I remember like when Stephen Levy wrote, I think it was like, was it Newsweek? We got this expose on, it was in, oh God, it was the Octoparts. It was the one that they were in. And it was like, meet the next billionaires. And I was just like, we've arrived. People know about us. This is so exciting. And then
this
it
is
became
Newsweek. So a boot camp
maybe
for
it's
the next
Newsweek.
tech billionaires in May
Yeah.
2007.
Okay. So 2007. Okay. So that's like 2 years later. That's not awful, that we got that 2 years into things. But then things could get a little antagonistic with the press, and they were always trying to knock us down and like, I feel like take things we said and twist it around. And I feel like I just have this list of media that I don't like. I don't know. It's sort of
It's still like that.
Someday
Don't
I'll write
worry.
about what?
Don't worry. It's still like that.
Oh, okay. All right. That makes me feel better.
And never stop. It was always like that. I don't know.
Was it? I mean, maybe just they're more tech press now and they're not all dedicated to being good reporters. They're just wanting to get clicks. I don't know.
When you're coming up, you're the golden child, and people do want to help, and then at some point it flips, and then you're the man or the thing to like sort of tear down because there's someone downtrodden, which is like I totally get, like that's like a whole trope for them. But
yeah, it's fun tearing people down.
I don't think
guess
you guys did a bad job. I thought you did an incredible job, honestly.
I don't know. It was that the other thing that I was, so maybe someday I'll write about the media from my perspective. The other thing I want to do someday, I want to have like a startup school reunion on, Carolyn and my podcast, The Social Radars, of like all the crazy stories of stuff that went wrong. Because the startup school every year that we do, there was always some bananas like thing that happened. Like one year when Justin TV had just started Justin TV, there was like a bomb threat at Stanford while it was going on. We almost had the whole event shut down. But I want to have like a little reunion of startup school players and reminisce about all the crazy stuff that happened.
You should not feel like you were bad at the media stuff. I think that was a really important part early on. What was it like? Was it Jenny 8 Lee wrote like an article or?
Oh, yes. Jenny 8 Lee wrote, no, the first article ever written about us was after the first summer. And I think it was Ryan Single. I think that was his name. And he wrote just a very quick little thing, and Sam Altman was in it. And then Jenny 8 Lee, I forget how we even met her, but she came to one of our dinners or something, and she wrote a pretty nice article about Y Combinator. And that was when we really thought, oh gosh, we've now arrived. We've been in the New York Times, and that was heaven.
Even for YC to know that was meaningful or valuable to work on is, I think, credit to you and what you worked on before then. I don't know. I mean, everything that came before comes from someplace.
I do think that my varied background did come. I was able to draw on certain things for Y Combinator, and to be fair, I did used to invite the press, do a little outreach, and invite them all to demo day, because I think even if I wasn't good at convincing them why Y Combinator was so great, I think if they came to demo day, they could observe for themselves why Y Combinator was so great. I mean, there was just so many novel things back then that people take for granted now. But even demo day, think about, as an investor, you have to take all these like singular meetings, one after another. Imagine being able to see, 10, 20, 25 startups all in one afternoon. That was novel. And then, talk to them all there. And I feel like a lot of the things that we did, I think reporters could sort of observe and think, wow, that's pretty different than what's usually going on.
Now we're at the point where, okay, so you were at the investment bank, and then did you leave the investment bank to work on YC? Or actually, there's like a whole story that you have talked about, at least privately with me.
Oh yeah, what? I'm like, what?
Flybridge Capital Partners, is that right?
So, okay, I have to remember the timing because it gets a little fuzzy. But basically, I met Paul in 2003. And through Paul and his friends, I was sort of introduced to this whole world of startups. And I immediately was drawn to it. I mean, I just felt like this is so cool and so much more exciting than anything I've ever done or seen. And I decided what was going on at the bank. I mentioned the bubble had burst. They're making cutbacks. And it just became a little bit boring at that point. And I wasn't that enthusiastic about writing another press release, because I had to fire the person that usually handled that. So to combat my boredom, I decided to write a book called Founders at Work. And it was based on the Writers at Work series, how they interviewed writers about how they wrote and stuff like that. And I said, there's nothing out there about startups. I read this book called Startup by Jerry Kaplan about his story about the Go, and I was riveted. And I just wanted to hear more of those stories. It was so crazy. And Paul told me stories about ViaWeb. And I remember thinking, this is mental. Like, I don't know about this stuff. Most people don't know about this stuff. And so I decided, just for a fun distraction for myself, I'd talk to some startup founders. And, I had a little tape recorder and I interviewed them. And I mean, I started small. I didn't have connections at this point, but I sort of would get an introduction. I interviewed Paul and then got a couple introductions. I forget who my first interviewees were. But then I got a book deal. It was actually, I got a book deal from O'Reilly and I got a little advance. And that is when I quit my job because I was getting kind of burnt out from the investment bank and I wanted to focus on the book. So I got this little advance and I said, I'm going to quit. But what had also simultaneously happened was that I had interviewed at this venture capitalist firm. It was for the director of marketing at their venture capitalist firm. And I sort of felt like working at a VC is one step closer to an early stage startup, than an investment bank. So I was really interested in this. And they just sort of, maybe in hindsight, they didn't take that long, but to me, it felt like they were taking months and months. And I'd interview with one person, they'd say, great, we'll come back in another 2 weeks. And it just took a long time. And so in this 6-week period, that is when Paul and I would go out to dinner every night and we'd be talking, he'd be like, oh, well, if you worked in marketing at a VC firm, maybe you could convince them to make smaller investments, because right now, they put in millions of dollars, but these, young founders, they don't need millions of dollars. They just need enough to pay the rent. And so we'd have all these conversations and we thought, they could really increase their deal flow by doing events like Startup School and all these different things. And over, 6 weeks, Paul, that's when he said, you know what, let's just start something ourselves. And I said, great. And that's when I went and told my dad I was quitting my job and is there going to be healthcare insurance? But I also had the book advance and the book to work on. So it was sort of like I had this crazy idea with Paul, but also the book. And I'd work on both, dual track. And I just did not want to be employed. And I actually did get offered a job at the VC firm, but I had already decided that this is what I was going to do. The best thing I ever did was take that risk, quit my job to start something new, even though it was a little scary and certainly unknown. The other amazing part of it that I just will tell people in hopes of inspiring them is that if you feel excited about something, to do something where you don't need to have a boss or you don't need to ask permission, to do it for yourself. Like writing a book, yeah, I had a publisher, but that was being driven by me. Everything about it was me, and I put everything into that book, and it turned out really well. But I wasn't constrained in any way by, other employees or, it was just, if you feel like you just take the risk, it will pay off. And if it doesn't work out, go back and do it. You'll get hired again doing what you were doing.
That's so empowering. That's awesome. That's a perfect message.
And save up the nest egg so that you can pay your rent.
That sounds right. Can I ask about like the first batch? There was Garden Street, obviously. And did you already have the space? Like, I mean,
Oh my
I'd
gosh.
love to hear
No.
about like even just from the perspective of you were potentially going to go into VC, and then this got a bunch of things sort of jogging in your heads. Like this
Yes.
could be done in
Yes.
a different way. But that's
Hmm.
still like pretty, being able to do it a different way is still very different than like, okay, here's the Summer Founders Conference and this is
Yeah.
happening.
Okay. So let me try to recreate this. So Paul said, let's just do this ourselves. And the plan was at first was that it would be a regular investment company. And Paul, who wanted to be an angel investor and help startups, but he does not like looking at pitches. He does not like taking meetings. He does not like distractions. He didn't want all of that. So I was going to run the company and, we'd have an office in Harvard Square and we'd take meetings and make investments. And he would specifically be there to advise the specific startups. And it was going to be all his money. And then he got Robert and Trevor to pitch in too. So just be very simple, but asynchronous investing. But immediately we thought, well, gosh, none of us really know how to be angel investors. So let's teach ourselves by doing this like program this summer. Cause I think it was in March and we thought we have time to catch people as they're graduating from college or are looking for an internship in the summer if they're a junior or something. Let's catch the programmers. Cause the whole thing, we wanted to fund programmers who might not know about business side of things, but they were good programmers and they could learn the business side of things, like Paul himself had to do. So we said, let's just do a summer founders program is what we called it. And Paul cooked up the website. We had, a few questions and we said, literally it just happened all so quickly. We're like, let's put the application out there and we'll interview people in 3 weeks or something, very quick time frame. And we'll call it the Summer Founders Program. It'll happen in Cambridge. And we're going to use Paul's personal office that he had bought and just had renovated and soundproof so that he could write without any, distractions. And it was the sweetest space. As you remember from being there that summer of 2008, wasn't it just the most fabulous space ever?
Oh yeah, it was perfect. I mean, perfect for
Yeah.
dinner and conversation, and it felt like custom designed.
It did, didn't it? It had open kitchen into this living room where we had the table. So then we had the tables built and they were trestled tables and benches. We had those built. But actually, I think first, before we built the tables and everything, we said, will we be funding anyone? We didn't even know if anyone would show up. But Paul posted this thing on his website, and I think it must have gotten on to Delicious or Slashdot because he had been writing essays. That's the only way Y Combinator could get started was that programmers specifically, followed Paul Graham because he was an expert in Lisp and he wrote some interesting essays.
So having distribution is a big deal. It's like that
Huge deal.
media stuff
Yeah.
is important. Just as for bankers, you have to get into traditional media or Newsweek or different things like that. For hackers, it had already gone on the internet first.
Yeah. And no one would know to have applied, if we didn't have this distribution. So that was key that we had this small, niche distribution channel, but it was the niche we were trying to appeal to. Perfect. And lo and behold, we got a bunch of applications. We're like, oh my gosh, there are a lot of people. So I think forget how many people we chose, but I think it was something maybe 15 startups a day. And we had these half an hour long interviews. Maybe they were even 40 minutes. I really should go back and check just to see how long, but they were super long. And at the end of the weekend, so part of this, we said, we're going to decide that day and we're going to call them all and tell them yes or no that night. Because that was one of the things that Paul said should be changed about venture capital is how long it took. How you get strung along and you just need a decision. The longer it takes, the more information the investor has. but it can kill a startup. Matter of months can kill a startup. So we interviewed them, called them back that night, and there were like 7 startups that we were funding. The Reddits were in that batch. Sam Altman was in that batch doing his like geolocation company before smartphones. Oh my gosh. He was he wasn't 18, but he was 19. He couldn't even rent a car, but he had to, fly to do deals with the carriers. Like that's what he was doing that summer, deals with carriers and stuff. And then, Emmett Shear and Justin Kahn of Twitch were in that doing a calendar app. So, we didn't know what we were doing, Garry. We just sort of put one foot in front of the other and said, well, we're going to help them. We're going to have these dinners once a week. And then Paul would cook the dinner, but I remember I'd put like candles out. We'd light a fire in the fireplace. I'd get cheese from Formaggio Kitchen, lemonade and stuff from Whole Foods. So it was like a dinner party every week. And these startups would come together and we'd have a guest speaker who we'd like scrounge up from our network. I mean, I think I invited someone from our investment bank to come talk about M&A. Like these guys needed to know about M&A. They didn't at that point, but this is what we were working with. We had a patent lawyer and stuff like that. But it was still, the model seemed really interesting, how people would come together once a week and they became friends and they'd, tell each other about their progress that week. And, Paul would advise them and I helped incorporate them. I had to because we wanted to save people the legal fees of having to hire a lawyer. So we thought, and this was totally novel at the time, we said, let's create template documents to incorporate. And there were like 7 different documents you needed. But it seemed complex, but you really just filled in the blanks here and there. And so I would go sit down with the founders and say, okay, this is what you do. And this is what you have to think about. How much stock do you want to allocate? And here's what it means. And then they'd file all the stuff and become companies.
That's so cool. I mean, I guess you just detailed like so many different ways where there was like an edge or a bug or just like a thing that was not quite right about how startups would start or how investors would invest in startups. And then each of those were different enough, like on their own, that they'd be differentiating. But when you combine them all together, they were sort of this mega punch, I guess, just like to the industry.
We were trying to lubricate that fulcrum of the world. You know what I mean? Because there were just all these teeny little hurdles that, young programmers might think were insurmountable, but they're not. And we thought younger people get started. Now all they need is a laptop and pay some hosting fees and stuff. And it was just getting a lot cheaper to start startups. And we thought younger people should be doing this. They don't need millions of dollars. They just need enough to help them pay the rent and eat and stuff until they can build something to then go on and get more funding. And that was demo day at the end of the summer.
It's so interesting to hear this arc because it sounds like the book was one of the first, like, of a sort, a startup, because, prior to that, you sort of had a boss or you had to like sort of be a part of a team or a system that was not your own. And then the book gave you total agency. And then YC was like this another level beyond that, that like has touched everyone. It's like so insane.
Turns out I love the freedom. I love working on my own projects, honestly. And had I been more self-aware or more in tune with the kind of person I was, I wish I kind of had discovered that when I was 23, but I didn't. But I loved working on my own projects. And I loved working with Paul. He was so smart and amazing. And we had so much fun working together, especially when it was just like the two of us. We just, we'd split up for the day. He'd do his thing. I'd do mine. We'd come together at night and continue to talk about it. We talked about YC all the time, always coming up with ideas to improve things. Because that's one of the things that we did at YC. We changed things on the fly. We always were experimenting with trying to improve things. Well, what if we just tweaked this? Would that improve it? And that's why YC is constantly being improved. You're improving it. A lot of the partners are improving it, but you got to be open to changing things a little bit.
Yeah. Having a great co-founder, then that's the proof's in the pudding for your story then too.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh. I think Paul and I were each other's like perfect co-founders because we were so different in many ways, but we were so similar. We shared the same values. We wanted the same things. We treated people, we had the same like moral compass, if you will, but we had totally different skill sets that were so foreign to the other. Like, I think Paul was still like amazed that I was able to open up a bank account, like, cause that would stop him in his tracks. And of course, Paul is like a genius for startup ideas and things like that. And he's, very much, he'll say whatever he thinks needs to be said. And whereas I'm like behind the scenes and I don't talk to people, publicly, we're just different personalities, but it worked perfectly. So picking the right co-founder is critical.
What I'm hearing is like, if you had figured out that you wanted to be a founder or to have agency, like really deep agency earlier, that would have helped you in like sort of all these other respects, like earlier maybe. And that it had to come to you like in the way it did. But people watching often are like, I don't feel like I have ownership over my life. Like things don't quite feel right. They're not clicking.
I definitely felt like something's not clicking. And I just always felt like I worked to earn money so that I could live. And I like lived for the weekends or my vacations or whatever. And even though I like enjoyed, I guess, what I was doing, I wasn't really that into it. And I certainly wasn't making money from it. That's the thing. As a 25-year-old, I was working, super long hours, but that didn't affect my salary. I'd work all weekend on an M&A announcement, all weekend. I remember there was one weekend where I had like 2 hours of sleep for 2 nights in a row because the deal was being announced. And we were up, with the investment bankers and the executives at the company. And my agency made tons of money. And I think, we got an orchid or something, as a thank you. And it's just like, so when I say I wish I had been more in tune with working on my own projects or thinking like, and maybe I didn't know enough back then to add any value. But again, when I was in my 20s, there wasn't the internet. You couldn't publish any blog posts. So I don't know where I would have published anything if I did have any pearls of wisdom for anyone. But the point is, I wish I had known I could work at a startup. I wish that seemed normal to me or a path that I could have taken, because I think it would have been a hell of a lot more interesting. I might have made some more money. And I don't know. I just think for me, it would have been better.
The year's 2005, you did your first, then your second sort of summer, it was like summer and then winter. Like, what were some of the things that were most surprising about like the interviews themselves? Because that's one thing that I realized was very special about YC. It's like, on the one hand, we give people money and we help them with their business. But part of the reason why we can help a lot of people is that we actually help all these other people too. I mean, the social radar, at least partially, I think, is also the sheer volume of having seen so many smart people and all the things that could go right and could go wrong. I mean, if you think about what a VC does, a VC might meet like hundreds of people a year and then fund like 5 of them. And then the ability to read 1,000 applications, like meet hundreds of people, and then like directly work with dozens of people per year over many years. Like, you see startups in a way that like the reason why venture capitalists do it the way they do it is like, it's designed for them. It's not designed for, sort of founders. And then you just see so much more. So it's almost like having a radar that only does a turn every year or something, as opposed to like every 5 minutes or every 2 minutes. Like you actually understand what's going on. And maybe that links into like what social radar or like radar period means. It's just like a frequency, and like you just see so much more.
Well, I'll tell you one thing that's interesting, and I hadn't really thought explicitly about it till you just asked me about it, but I had all of these startups that I was working with, helping, advising, seeing fail, seeing succeed, all of this shit that you just see when you're funding, 80 startups, 100 startups. I mean, by the time I left, the batches were getting pretty big. So you just see a lot of it. But don't forget also that every Tuesday night, we would have a Mark Zuckerberg come, or, some famous successful startup come talk. And I pulled up my chair, right next to the YC founders in the audience. I never missed a talk because I learned so much from them. So I have crazy stories coming at me from like the YC founders who are just getting started. Then you have the kind of crazy stories in hindsight that were, by the way, back when I was there, people were sharing stuff they had never shared publicly, and because they trusted the YC audience, and we had a rule, you're not allowed to tweet about anything that's shared. And for many years, secrets were kept in the office, in the YC office. So I was learning about it from that end too. Then I did, the Founders at Work book, learned a lot from that. And during startup school, I would often be the one interviewing the speakers. Like if they didn't want to prepare a presentation, I'd interview them. So I loved learning about them from questions that I had from that. So I was just having all of this input come in. And I think I can't help but want to do something with that, and I love talking to people. I love hearing about how people overcome adversity in any way, but especially in startups. I love hearing stories about that. I love talking to these super successful, famous people who tell me about how they couldn't raise any money because everyone starts out the same way. You're nobody when you start. And it's just, I find it very inspirational because I've always believed, and I still believe, that anyone who is sufficiently ambitious and determined and reasonably smart can start a startup. Like anyone can do this if they want to. So I just hope, I like to continue sharing stories from the most successful startups because I just feel like it'll just inspire more people to do it themselves.
Jessica, that's a perfect place to end. Thank you so much. This is awesome.
You're welcome.